These days when there's so few priests in the world, oftentimes what gets emphasized is the obligations that we have that can be restrictive. I can tell you that one of the things that I really appreciate in my priestly life is a promise of obedience that I actually made as a deacon when I was preparing to, or in the ordination ceremony to become a deacon, where I promised to pray for God's people. It's an obligation that I take very seriously, and that I know many of my brothers do as well. I have a conversation with a friend of mine that seems to crop up every once in a while, and I think I've talked about it in homilies before, about how much we appreciate this obligation to pray, because frankly, it forces us to do so. Like, we've made a promise before God under penalty of sin that we are going to pray. And so even on those days where we don't really want to pray, you know what? There's this, okay, I made this solemn promise, I better keep it. And I'm grateful for it because it actually makes me pray. Now, I will tell you that my prayer life does go beyond that. So I'm obligated to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, which is based in the Psalms, basically 5 periods of prayer a day. But beyond that, I've got daily mass that I'll have. As many of you know, I pray the Rosary regularly. Big fan of the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. Take time for adoration and the like. All this to say, prayer is very important in my life. But really, what drives it is this obligation to prayer, for which I'm grateful. I guess what I want to say is I really want to encourage you in your own way, even though you don't have an obligation as I do or as other men and women in consecrated life do, to pray in the same way that we do. I would encourage you to make a daily commitment to it. When we come into the presence of the Lord, He changes us. When we enter into the presence of grace, grace isn't just other. Grace enters into us. It penetrates our very being. It transforms us. And, I bring it up because I think in the world in which we live, oftentimes you'll see that phrase, thoughts and prayers. I guess the question I always have is, when that phrase comes up, how much praying is actually done? Like, how often when that phrase is put out, and I mean, I'll say it for myself too. Like, I'll make promises to pray, and I need to remind myself to actually do that. And so, like, sometimes, I'll say, I'll pray for you, and then I'll forget, like, oh my gosh, like, who did I promise to pray for? And so one of the things I've done regularly these days is say, okay, Lord, I'm bringing before you anyone that I've promised to pray for. All this to say, it's important that we not just talk about prayer or that we promise to pray, but that we actually do it. It's a blessing for me that I am obliged to do that. Every time I do pray the Liturgy of the Hours, it's for the salvation of the church and the world. And even though you might not have that particular obligation, I would invite you, do take time for prayer. For yourself, it changes you. For others, prayer changes the world. And we really need that right now, whether or not we've actually made a promise liturgically, vocationally, to do that. You all take care.